What I wanted to do last week is do a slight, really quick orientation to the class. And I think it's always good to give a refresher as to why we're doing this for those of us who have been here for a while. But this class is called Foundations. Its goal is to look at the foundations of Christian faith and the foundations of reality and the way God has set things up in order that we may be able to have a foundation to work from, to think off of. The fancy word, or the philosophical word, is presuppositions. When you have certain presuppositions about the way the world works, it affects everything you do. Yes. What you truly believe about reality is going to affect your actions. If you believe that gravity doesn't exist, and the moment you step outside of this room, you're going to float off into space and starve in the cosmos somewhere, you're not going to step out of this room. So your erroneous belief would shape your choices. So it's very important, in other words, to have right beliefs about reality, to have right beliefs about God, to have right beliefs about life and what is right and what is wrong and so on and so forth. So on a moral level, it's really important, but also I believe that very strongly that Christianity is a reasonable faith. It's reasonable. And that is somewhat at odds with the way it's presented many days, and even with the way many Christians try to live it out. There's this perceived conflict between faith and reason, or faith and thought. You say, well, no, Christianity is about faith in God, and so I don't have to think about it. I can just close my eyes and, don't question me. I believe it's true, and therefore nothing else matters. And faith is very important, obviously. Faith is core to what Christianity is. But if you look at the New Testament, you look at these guys like Peter or Stephen or Paul, when they brought the gospel to people around them, it was never just hey, come on guys, quit asking me these questions, you should just believe. They always reasoned with them. They started them at a ground level, and they showed them why Jesus Christ is the Messiah, or why this is really the way you should be living life. You look at in Acts chapter 2, which is this is the big beginning, the blow up of the church. Paul is speaking to hundreds and thousands of Jews gathered together on the day of Pentecost, and he reasoned with them. He went back to their understanding of the Old Testament. He broke it down, showing how Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It was a reasoning process all the way up to the end, and that converted hundreds and then thousands and then thousands, and in one day, over 3,000 people were added to the church in one moment. Because the Holy Spirit, working alongside Peter, they reasoned and showed them why this stuff made sense. Acts chapter 7, when Stephen was martyred. Hey, John. Acts chapter 7, when Stephen was martyred, he was reasoning with the crowd around him, and it converted people, it changed people. It messed with Saul's heart and led to his conversion later on. But he reasoned with them. It was 100% reasoning. It wasn't a miraculous explosion of Holy Spirit power that changed everybody. It was helping people along to see why this is true, why this is right. And even when you go looking at the way Paul does things, it's always reasoning. Whether he's dealing with Jews or Gentiles or whoever it is, he went to their level and he showed them why Christianity is right. And so I believe likewise we have a responsibility to reason with the people around us. I think it's very irresponsible for Christians to not know what they believe, and to be afraid of being asked, or to be afraid of even questioning their own beliefs because they don't have the ability to answer those questions. People get afraid because they feel like there is no ability to answer those questions, and therefore I can't answer them, but it's simply not true. Reasonably speaking, if Christianity is true, then there's going to be an answer to every question. And so far, and I certainly haven't asked every question in the world, but so far I've never, upon honest examination, found a question I couldn't answer in light of the Bible or in light of just simple reasoning. I have no outstanding questions, in other words, at this point. And I'm so young and inexperienced, like all of us in this room are, comparatively speaking. But I'm very confident that there is no question that God is afraid of or can't answer. And finally, we're called to reason. Peter, in speaking out to the churches, he says, you guys have a responsibility to always be prepared to provide a defense when people come to you asking questions. When they say, why do you believe this stuff? Why is your life different? How could you put your trust in God, or whatever the question is? He says you need to always be prepared to provide a defense for the hope that's within you. And it's that word, Paul said, apollovia, which is the Greek word meaning towards the defense. Always be prepared to provide apollovia, which is where we get the word in English, apologetics. In other words, reasoning out your faith, working towards an answer, and helping people understand. It's not a matter of arguing or proving someone right or making them feel like a fool because you know more than them. It's a matter of saying, I want to show you why I have this hope inside of me and why my life looks the way it is. That's what apologetics is all about. And so this isn't an apologetics class, but in many ways it is. Not for the sake of debating, but for the sake of knowing what you believe and for the sake of being able to speak it out to people who ask questions. I should just mention this as an overarching rule. The Bible is also very clear that arguing and debating and whatever else is never helpful. Paul says in 2 Timothy that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, because it doesn't help anything. We're not here to fight with people or prove them wrong. So, very quickly, for those of you who are new, and even for those of you who aren't, as a refresher, I have just some really short guidelines for the class. First of all, everything you do, whether it's learning or writing something down or having a discussion before or after or during class here, do it in love. Do it in consideration of the people around you and of me and of God and of yourself. Do it in love. I really, really welcome questions and observations and thoughts. So whatever it is, stick your hand up and say whatever you want, but we're here to love and to learn, not to fight or to argue or to whatever else. If you want to argue with me, I don't care. It's fine. But please wait until after class, because there's a lot of other people who are in here who want to learn, and an argument can take up 10 minutes of everyone else's time. I once sat through a week of a very proud man who refused to listen to opinions different from his own, arguing for hours with a teacher who had a lot of stuff he wanted to share, a lot of people who wanted to hear it, but he wouldn't consider the people around him, and he argued with them the whole time. And so everyone else missed out. 30 people missed out on a lot of cool stuff because somebody couldn't consider those around them. So by all means, disagree with me. By all means, argue with me. Just wait until after class. Number 3, please don't monologue. I welcome questions and I welcome observations and thoughts. Just raise your hand. But just remember, there are other people in here. Once again, whether you're arguing or monologuing, it's still taking up everyone else's time. So please share, but be considerate. Once again, it all comes down to do everything in love, and everything else gets pretty simple. Number 4, please don't be disruptive. If you have a cell phone call or if you want to eat something, just step out for a second. Once again, consider everyone in here. 5, please be respectful to whoever has the floor. So don't talk over somebody, talk in turn, that makes sense. Since I'm teaching the class, that'll be me 99% of the time. But if someone else is speaking, just wait and then add whatever you need to. Raise your hand and just be considerate. And finally, this is my favorite, be Berean. Berean. In Paul's second missionary journey in the book of Acts, he went to a place called Berea. Right prior to that, you guys have heard of Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He went to a place with his group called Thessalonica. And the Jews there, he was spreading the gospel and telling about Jesus Christ, and they wouldn't hear any of it. They refused to hear any of it. They argued and fought, and they rioted and drove them out of town. Actually, they beat him till he was almost dead and left him for dead, and then he just got up and left town after they left him. That was Thessalonica, and afterwards they went to a place called Berea. And it says the Jews in Berea were more noble than the Jews in Thessalonica. And they heard what Paul had to say, and they earnestly examined the scriptures every single day to see if the things he was saying were true. And because they did that honestly, they saw that what he was saying made sense, and they converted to Christianity in large numbers. The difference was the Jews in Thessalonica refused to listen to any of it simply because it was new or different. However, if the Bereans had just said, okay, well, this guy's saying it, and he looks like a smart guy, so we'll just believe it, that would be every bit as irresponsible. In other words, being Berean means listening to every new opinion and earnestly and honestly examining it and thinking it through and looking at Scripture and praying about it until you can come to your own conclusions. One of my favorite teachers used to tell me, and favorite teachers in Bible school used to tell me, if you walk out of here disagreeing with everything I've said, simply because it's different from your views, you have made a huge mistake. But if you walk out of here agreeing with everything I've said, simply because I'm saying it, you've made an equally huge mistake. So just examine it. Be reasonable, think it through. That's what it means to be Berean. And that's all. There's the quickest version I can give of a quick class orientation. So the last couple weeks, we have been doing kind of a quick primer of how to study the Bible. The things you need to consider, the focuses you need to have, the questions you need to be asking, so on and so forth. There's a lot more to look at, but I wanted to give a really quick update. For those of you who missed it, if you want to check it out, we have those available online. I also have a more in-depth version of that we did last year with like 4 weeks as opposed to just 2 weeks. That's also available on our YouTube channel. But tonight, we are finally stepping into specifically looking at a book of the Bible. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on basically, as opposed to looking at concepts and then looking at Scripture that relates to the concepts, we're going to be looking at Scripture and then using that as the gateway into looking at concepts. Because there's, every major theological point you can think of is touched on in Scripture at one point or another. So we're going to be looking at the book of Galatians. And that'll be tonight and next week and every week further from that until we're done with the book of Galatians. At which point we'll likely move on to the next, to another book of the Bible, probably in the New Testament. But really quickly, the goal would be you guys being able to walk out of here with a very solid understanding of Galatians and every major principle and application that it presents in the book. Because it's full of crazy good stuff, like pretty much every book in the Bible is. Stuff that applies to our lives and stuff that can transform the way we view God and view Christianity and view the law and view how to live. But as we read this, and I would encourage you guys to read it, especially if you plan on coming back recurringly, read this book outside of class. Not just once, but try to read it and try to understand it yourselves. So that when you come here, you have opinions. And you have thoughts, and you've thought through it already, and then you get to align up your opinions with my opinions, and with other people's opinions in the class as we share them together and as we learn together. So anything you find as you're looking, feel free to share. I love that. I love hearing other people's perspectives. But I am going to point out a few things for you guys as you read it, whether here or at home, to be looking for, because there are some major themes and some things you can look for in Galatians. As you find them, feel free to write them down and share them when you come to class or ask questions about them week by week. I'm not going to elaborate on what these things mean right now. I'm just going to list them off so you can have them in your head and start looking for them a little bit. But some things to be looking for in this book. Big thing in general is Galatians is a book of contrasts. It contrasts kind of almost in black and white some various things. Well, there's a lot of gray areas as well. But you're going to be looking at contrasts between faith versus works of the law. Contrast between your spirit versus works of the law. The contrast between your spirit versus your flesh, and what that means. And finally, and I won't write this one down, but this is more by principle as opposed to explicit words you'll see. You'll see all these words repeatedly throughout the book. But in principle, look for a contrast between relationship and religion. Relationship and religion. And once again, in general, I'll be looking for any principle or application you find, because I really like to hear that kind of stuff from you guys. I really need some new markers. Does anyone carry markers with them?
No.
I'd be kind of weirded out if you did. Okay, and so once again, as we go through this, we're going to be doing a lot of like kind of preparatory work, some background and contextual work as we go before we get into the meat of the book. But please feel free to ask questions at any time. Some of you have been in here for a lot longer than others. Some of you have been here since right at the beginning. Some of you have been here since halfway through. Some of you have been here since last week, and some of you it's your first time here. So feel free to ask questions wherever you're at. I'm going to try to make this as relevant to everybody as possible. So I'm not assuming that you have all this background knowledge or information. But let's start right at the beginning. How many of you guys have read the book of Galatians at least once before? So most of us in here have read Galatians. Okay. Like we talked about last week when we were looking at how to study the Bible, there are things, as with every book, there are things that we need to do and some things that we need to figure out about Galatians before we can just jump in and start studying it. There are things that we need to know in order to understand what's being communicated in this book, communicated to us and what was being communicated back then. So, before jumping into this kind of book, what are some questions that might be a good idea to ask before reading it even, or before trying to study it?
Who's the audience?
Okay, you just list them off.
Who's
Okay.
he talking to?
Yeah, who's he talking to? Who's the audience?
Who's the author?
Who's the audience? Who's the author?
The location.
Who's the author? Where? Where was it written? Where was it written to?
Where and when?
Where and the when? Yeah.
Well, where, when?
All those W questions.
And why?
These
And
markers
why?
are worthless.
And why was it written?
Yeah, that was the big thing when I was reading it is, what is this other philosophy that he's referring to that he keeps
Why?
saying, don't be drawn to this? Like, what exactly is it that they're forsaking his teachings in favor of?
Yeah. The where, the when, the why, the who. This is, it's the basic whodunit, right? It's basic questions you need to know to figure out really like anything at all. And the Bible's no different. Simply having the answer to questions like those is massively beneficial. It gives you an idea what's happening. So many people pick up the Bible and they just read it. And like, okay, what can I apply to my life out of what's being said here? And so they'll skim over 90% of the things that are mentioned so they can find something that remotely applies to their life. And they go, oh, cool, I got that. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. What would be worse is just not doing it at all. However, you're missing out on the actual communication that's happening. In other words, as a result, you're missing out on the majority of what's being spoken, the majority of what's being said, and the majority of what you could be applying to your life and learning from. So, yeah, those are all good questions. Those are all really good questions. There's one you guys missed, though, or at least one you guys missed, one really important basic question. With Galatians, this is an easy one, but what is the literary genre?
Oh, no. No.
What is the literary genre? In other words, every book in the Bible has a genre that the type of literature it is falls into. For instance, the book of Acts. How many of you guys have read that before?
Yeah.
It's very straightforward. It's a recording of what happened. Okay, this guy did this thing and then went to this place and did this thing. And that guy did that thing and went to this place and did that thing and so on and so forth. It's just a recording of history over a period of about 35 years or so. It's the book of Acts. As opposed to, say, Proverbs. Proverbs is very clearly not a historical narrative. It's just a bunch of kind of one-liners. It's polemical. It's a whole different teaching. It's proverbial. Yes?
I was reading today, and I don't know if this is correct, but he is introducing who he was, who he is, and how he goes on I loved it. He said, I immediately went up to meet the other guys for so many days so that I could find out what they were saying. I mean, it's a real paraphrase, but,
Right.
you know, he's introducing himself. He's letting everybody know who he is, what he is. This is where I'm at, this is where I'm going. And I was ordained by Christ to do this, by my birth.
Yeah. So if Acts is an historical narrative, and if Proverbs is a polemical, proverbial recording of one-liners and many teachings, what is Galatians?
It's a letter.
It's a letter.
It's an epistle. Okay.
And the word epistle means letter.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, it means letter written to an individual, but it's become used today in terms of scholarship to mean biblical letter. Specifically, all those books. And you'll notice in the New Testament, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you have Acts. And then you have a ton of letters. And it's letters until the end of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts are all historical narratives. And then it switches from that point on to letters, epistles only, until the end of the Bible. Even Revelation, it's an epistle.
We don't have to think of that. It's true.
It was written to specific churches for a specific purpose. And the specific purpose was not to tell them what was going to happen 3,000 years from now. Now, that's just my opinion. So yeah, Galatians, and I'll write it over here, hopefully ink. Galatians, that's too bad. You guys are not going to have writing up there tonight until I have some new ones. Galatians is a letter. It is a letter, and with, as is the case with all letters, there's something you'll notice about really every letter ever written. It has someone who wrote it, and it has someone who was written to. In other words, there's a person or people that composed, that authored this letter, and there's a person or people that it was written or sent or aimed towards. So let's ask both of those questions, starting with number one. Who wrote Galatians?
Paul.
Okay, why do you think that? Yes, you'll notice literally, the first word in Galatians is Paul.
Yeah.
An apostle of Jesus Christ, yada, 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 5 verses of introduction, and then I start saying what I'm actually trying to say. So yes, it's Paul. Paul wrote this letter, and if you were to take a percentage of scholars that say, well, maybe he didn't really write this letter, it'd be like 2%. There's always somebody that wants to find a conspiracy somewhere. But Paul wrote this letter. Now, what do you guys know about Paul?
He used to be Saul.
Paul used to be called Saul, formerly called Saul.
Used to be a Jewish Pharisee.
He not used to be. He
He
was a Pharisee. He was a Jewish man who was a Pharisee. What's a Pharisee?
A scholar of the Jewish law.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Like a keeper making sure it stayed.
Yeah. So basically, there were various sects in the early, in first century Jewish history. The Pharisees were a group that kind of banded together to say, look, we have over and over and over again, the Jews have experienced serious punishment from God. You go all the way back to the Samaritans. You look at the northern kingdom that turned away from God and turned away from his law and got destroyed by Assyria, and now the Samaritans. And then the southern kingdom, which is the same thing, got dragged away by Babylon. And then God released us, and then we turned away from him again, and then the Seleucid Greeks showed up. And then we started rising up again, and then the Romans came in. And so you guys have heard of the Zealots. The Zealots were this group that said, we need to kill our oppressors and forcefully raise Judah back up as a kingdom. The Pharisees said, no, we deserved all this because we turned away from God's law over and over and over again. And so the Pharisees represented a group that said, we have to follow God's law to the T in every aspect of life. And so there was a lot of prestige to being a Pharisee. You couldn't just say, I'm a Pharisee, because I agree with that stuff. You had to be, basically you had to extremely intelligent, you had to know your stuff, and you had to be confirmed by another group of 3 qualified Pharisees in your knowledge and understanding and where you were at to be inducted into the order. It became more and more institutionalized as time went on. But Paul was one of those guys.
He was also very young.
He was a young guy. Mm-hmm. He was a young, very zealous Pharisee.
Mhm.
Young and fiery and really into everything. With the early church, we know that Paul was the biggest persecutor of Christians around. It talks about in Acts chapter 7 that he's the prime persecutor, that he was breathing threats against the Christians. He was going around from city to city and arresting them and tracking them down and getting them into massive amounts of trouble. Because, to certain parts of the Jewish, certain Jews, the Christians represented something weird. And then it became even more intense later on, but, we'll look at that later. We know that Saul studied under a very famous Pharisee named Gamaliel.
Oh, yeah.
We learned that in Acts chapter 22. And he studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. And he also mentions in Galatians that as he studied under Gamaliel, he progressed very quickly. He started gaining renown as a very intelligent young Pharisee studying under this great. He was on track to being one of the big guys. We know from Acts 26 that he was a member of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
What's the Sanhedrin?
It's like a council.
Yeah, it was the Jerusalem High Council, the High Council of the Jews. So think like the Supreme Court here. He was a member. He was one of the big dogs making the decisions that affected all of the Jewish people. The powers of justice in his hands. So he's young, but you talk about like one of the young guys in politics that's just like tearing everything up and he's rising to the ranks really quickly. This was Paul. This was Saul. So who was the first Christian that was ever martyred?
Stephen.
Yes. Somebody once told me Jesus, and I went, no. Christian, follower of Christ. A guy named Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Before that, there had been some weird kind of tension between these Christians and the Jews, because at that point, all Christians were Jews.
And Stephen Paul was involved in the death of Stephen.
Paul was there.
He was there helping to
He watched it.
stone him.
He held
Yeah.
the cloaks of the other members of the Sanhedrin as they, here, hold this, Saul, while we kill this guy. So he was an onlooker. And it was after that it said he went ballistic and started going after all Christians. He led the charge to exterminate these guys. And then it's in Acts chapter 9 that we learn how Saul was converted to Christianity. You guys heard that story before? What happened?
Yeah.
On the road to Damascus,
Going to Damascus.
he saw Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it says Saul was en route to a place called Damascus.
Mhm.
And you know why he was going there?
To kill
Find more Christians to get. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Damascus is north of Jerusalem. So he's spreading out and further to try to track down these pesky Christians. En route to Damascus, Paul mentions at one point that the death of Stephen affected him. He sat there and watched him. And Stephen didn't just it wasn't exactly seized overnight and had nothing to say. He was stoned because of the things that he said in front of the council. He basically preached and said, here's what you guys are doing wrong. You're missing the point. You're missing Jesus Christ. You're missing the fulfillment of our scriptures. And that's when they freaked out and stoned him. But apparently, Saul was ripe for what God wanted to do in his life. Something in him, whatever it was ready for God's plan for him. But in any case, this is around AD 33 or 34. So fairly soon after Jesus was crucified. And very soon after the church was founded. Once again, it says Saul, he's after Christians. He's going to Damascus to get them. And en route, as you guys said, he encounters the risen Jesus Christ. It says there was a blinding light that immediately blinded Saul, and that he heard an audible voice. It was Jesus Christ saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The men who were with him, it says, heard the voice, but they didn't see anything. So Saul is blinded immediately, and Christ tells him to continue on to Damascus. So the men had to lead him there by the hand because he was blind. He was blind for 3 days. He didn't eat or drink in those 3 days' time. And as many of you know, after 3 days, God sent somebody to him to heal him. And what did he do after that? He was baptized and became a Christian immediately. And then what did he do?
Started preaching.
Like the day of, he goes into the synagogue, which is the place where the Jews gathered to, do their studying and worship and stuff like that. He immediately goes to the synagogue and starts telling everybody about Jesus. Immediately. So this guy's like, oh, well, Paul's a little extreme, a little zealous. That's not a normal reaction. It's in my opinion that in that split second, that I think that having been there with Stephen and hearing what Stephen had to say, that he had these things hanging over his head, hanging over his heart for the weeks after that, and he was going to be drowning them out by persecuting these people. It's my opinion that in that split second when Jesus shows up, that Saul saw Stephen's testimony as confirmed, and that all of the arguments he had against Stephen were blown to pieces in that instant. And so it wasn't even a matter of, well, what should I do? It was a matter of, I was wrong. Yeah. And now I'm going to devote myself with every bit as much energy as I was persecuting Christians to furthering the gospel, which is what you see him do. It seems to me that God really, really wanted really, really wanted Saul on his side, as it were. God says of Saul, he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings of the children of Israel. Now, what's particularly significant about that?
The Hebrew apostles didn't want anything to do with the Gentiles at the time.
Basically. Yeah. Not just apostles, but specifically the Jews. It's a very big deal at this point in history, because at this point, the church is 100% Jew. There are no Gentiles. Now, who are the Gentiles?
Non-Jews.
That's us, guys. Unless one of you has Jewish heritage. Well, most of us in here are Gentiles. Yeah. If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Now, God's words are a very big deal because, again, the church is 100% Jew. There's nobody in the church that isn't a Jew. And the Jews had developed a tendency towards kind of, a special club kind of mentality. We are the chosen. Yes. We are God's people. We have the privilege, and everyone else is on the outside. God loves us, and then there's everyone else. Which is obviously a perversion of what God explicitly told them over and over again in the Old Testament, but that's how it happened. And that was a tendency. And this is what God says he wants to use Saul for. He says, I want this guy to carry my name to the Gentiles, and even before the kings of the children of Israel. And so, to your knowledge, did God use Saul?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most of us know that, yeah, he did. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Saul is possibly the biggest force for spreading the gospel in the New Testament period of history. There's probably nobody we can credit more with the spread of the gospel into the West than this guy, Saul. But we need to know, and this is where I'm tying this back into what we're talking about here. Saul is very firmly Jewish. He's a Jew. He called himself a Jew amongst Jews, a Pharisee amongst Pharisees. Very zealous about his heritage and what he does. And he comes from that massive focus the Pharisees place on the law. It's again, his heritage. So that's a quick primer on Paul. That is the relevant information, immediately speaking, for Galatians. And it's important we know everything I just said because of the way Paul is going to deal with the issues he deals with in Galatians. I saw a hand, I think. Yes?
Did Paul and Barnabas team up together?
They did. And actually, we'll get there in a second. Okay. So just really quickly to give you an update on what Paul did. He became a Christian And the Jews kind of took that as an offense, because suddenly there went one of their brightest and best, young, promising Pharisees, who was persecuting these punks called the Christians, and now he's on their side. And now he's preaching at us. So they tried to kill him really quick. They had to smuggle him out of Damascus and kind of put him in hiding for about 3 years. And even when he resurfaced, he was experiencing some serious antagonism from the Jews. And so basically he kind of lies low for about 14 years. 14 years from Acts chapter 9 until Acts 13. We don't hear from him again. He even mentions that in Galatians. It's like, and then I was gone for about 14 years. But that is, it's when he comes out of that kind of period of lying low that we'll be concerned with him again. In just a second. So Paul wrote Galatians. You should not have any doubt of that. But who was it written to?
Galatians?
The Galatians. Specifically, verse 2, it says, the churches in Galatia. It's actually an important distinction because in this period of history, further north, there are a people group called the Galatians. And further south, there's a Roman province called Galatia. So which one is it written to? Oh no, and there's a split between scholars, but with more recently in history, there's less of a split.
It says Galatians.
The churches in Galatia, yeah. So there's the Galatian people, and there's the province of Galatia, and it could be either one. Now, I have a very strong opinion, and I'll tell you what it is. Once again, there are differences in opinion, so feel free to research it yourself. In my opinion, it is almost certainly referring to the Roman province called Galatia, and I'll show you why that matters in just a moment. I'll give you a map. The main reason for this is Saul, as we're going to see in a second, was responsible for bringing the gospel to the Roman province of Galatia. And he founded all of the churches in that area. Whereas with the northern region of the northern Galatian region, he had never been there. Now remember how I mentioned that Saul, a second ago I said that Saul lied low for a little while? And he disappeared off the map for a bit. And he wasn't going to show up again until Acts chapter 13. Well, it's in Acts chapter 13, Saul and Barnabas, who was a more mature Christian, who when Saul was converted, Barnabas kind of took him under his wing and vouched for him and said, "I'll look out for you, buddy," and kind of mentored him a little bit. They were sent out on a missionary journey by the church in a place called Antioch. Antioch, just so you know, was the third biggest city in the Roman Empire. Very big western city. And so the church in Antioch said, look, we want to spread the gospel out to more people. So we're going to send you two out, because they were both extremely intelligent, very capable guys. You guys are going to go out and you're going to spread the gospel to these new areas. And this is in AD 46 that they set out. So once again, he was converted in 33, 34, around there, and here we are many, many years later. He's being sent on his first missionary journey of 3. This is what makes up the majority of the book of Acts, is the first, second, and third missionary journey of Saul. But I'll show you guys a map really quick. If I can bring it up. Oh, come on, you. Why you gotta be like that? Well, that's interesting. Have trouble getting it up. That's okay. Wow, that's a pain. Oh, there you go. I had blacked it out. Okay, can you guys see that map? It's not very big. Way down here, this is where Jerusalem is, okay? So for those of you who have at least a decent idea of the way the world is shaped, there's Jerusalem. This is the Middle East. Palestine, right here, okay? Up north, there's Damascus. That's where Paul had his conversion. Way up here is Antioch. That's big Roman city I told you about that sent Paul and Barnabas out. And over here is the island of Cyprus, as it's still known today. The island of Cyprus. Saul and Barnabas first go to Cyprus as they're working their way west. This is their first stop. And I'll just leave that up there for you guys. But they start spreading the gospel in Cyprus, and they're focusing, again, on the Jews, because that's what people did. That's what you do. They would stop at the synagogue where they would meet to learn and worship, and they would tell them about Jesus Christ the Messiah and how he fulfills all the scriptures. And they had some success. But notably, it's here in Cyprus that Saul starts being called Paul and calling himself Paul. And he's really only, I think he's called Saul twice after this, but it's right here that suddenly Saul is Paul. And I always like to mention this because I just think it's funny. But people always say, oh, and then he was Saul and he was a bad, bad man. And then he became a Christian and his old name passed away and he became Paul the Christian. So Saul's the bad name and Paul's the good name. What's funny is he became a Christian and then he continued calling himself Saul for up until this point. So there was no, here's my conversion, I'll choose a new name for a new me. There wasn't any of that. Actually, the reason was because after this point, here in Pamphos, they moved further west. After that point, they moved into areas that were dominated by Gentiles. Relatively small amounts of Jewish presence, very highly concentrated presence of Gentiles. Saul is a Hebrew name. Paul is a Greek name. And he just wanted to be a little more relevant. That's why.
What
That's the only
year
reason.
was that around?
Say again?
What time period was he in Cyprus?
AD 46.
46.
Yes.
Oh, that's right.
Yep. So if anyone tells you that you should change your name when you become a Christian,
Saul, you said it's a
Don't do
Greek name.
No.
Saul's Hebrew, Paul is Greek. Yeah. And Paul was a Roman citizen by birth. Yeah. So anyway, that's just a side note here. After Cyprus, and this is what concerns us here. Once again, here's Jerusalem, so you should have a general idea of where that is. I have a weird setup. I've got my notes here, and I've got the PowerPoint going at the same time. Otherwise, I could zoom in. But there's Jerusalem, there's Antioch. They went to Cyprus, and then they went up here to the northwest. They landed at a place called Perga, and they ministered there for a little while, and then they went to a place called Antioch again. So there's two Antiochs. This is what we call Pisidian Antioch, because this region is known as Pisidia. Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. I don't know if you can see this, but right here, it says Galatia. Antioch, or Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe are the Galatian churches.
Oh, okay.
And I'll show you how that came to pass. But once again, Paul and Barnabas, now he's Paul, I'm not going to call him Saul anymore. They go to Pisidian Antioch, then Iconium, then Lystra, then Derbe, which are all areas in the Roman province, Galatia. And in every city they went to, they spread the gospel and they founded churches in every city. All four of these. Now there's something very, very significant for the sake of reading Galatians here that we need to know happened in Pisidian Antioch, this first area they stopped at. Like I said here, Paul and Barnabas they would stop at the synagogue. And they would preach to the Jews. They would say, here's how it is, and everything goes well. And they went to Pisidian Antioch, and the Jews got really excited. A really, really good reception. And they begged Paul and Barnabas to come back the next week to teach them more. Tell us more about this Jesus. This is in Acts chapter 13, right near the end of the chapter, by the way. So the next week rolls around. The next Sabbath comes around. Paul and Barnabas are ready to preach, and a ton of Jews show up, ready to hear. However, it also mentions that almost the entire rest of the whole city of Pisidian Antioch showed up. And what does that mean?
Gentiles.
A lot of Gentiles. So if you have 150 Jews show up excited, you'd have 1,000 Gentiles show up. And you're like, who spread the word to these guys? But somehow it happened, and somehow the Gentiles were really excited. They wanted to hear about this new thing that Paul and Barnabas had to teach them about. Now, what's interesting is, a couple chapters prior to this, so just right before this in history, God had initiated the move of the gospel to the Gentiles. Once again, it's 100% Jews at this point, but God had basically put things in motion for the gospel, the church to be spreading the gospel to the Gentiles by using the Apostle Peter, who was one of the leaders of the church at that time. Again, you can read that in Acts chapter 10 and chapter 11 with a guy named Cornelius, who was a Roman guard. But the church, once again, is 100% Jewish up to that point. And so they're kind of like, yeah, they're iffy about it, but it soon became very clear that this was God's will. He wanted all the rest of us, not just the Jews, to get this thing called the gospel. So Paul and Barnabas, this is chronologically after that happened. Paul and Barnabas see the Gentiles, and they're like, okay, I guess it's time. Like, God has obviously brought these people here, and they're excited. They're ready to go. This is great. The Gentiles, all these non-Jews, are excited to hear about Jesus Christ. This is a huge opportunity. So it's great, right? Well, not so much, because the Jews flip their lids. They flip out. They see all the Jews around. They go, what are these filthy Jews? They see all the Gentiles around. What are these filthy Gentiles doing at our get-together? It's like if someone you really doesn't like shows up to your barbecue, but brings like 80 people with them. What are you doing here? This is our thing. How dare you guys? And then they get mad at Paul. How dare you share this news with the Gentiles? This is a message for us. This is about our scriptures and our teaching and our truth. We have exceeded our record for the largest foundations meeting ever. The Jews are really, really mad. This is our special message. This is our big new thing. How dare Paul speak to these people? How dare he even associate with them? And so they're wigging out, and Paul isn't having anything. He's not having anything of it. He says this to the whole Jewish crowd. He says, "Since you thrust aside the word of God and judge yourself unworthy of eternal life, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles. For so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light to the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." That's Acts chapter 13, verses 46 and 47. So
I'm sorry.
Acts 13,
Yeah.
46 and 47. Now actually, when he says there, the Lord has commanded us, saying, I've made you a light to the Gentiles, to bring salvation to the whole earth, he's actually quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting Isaiah.
Yeah.
And those words were directed to the entirety of the Jewish people. God was saying, I've made you a light to the Gentiles. You guys are supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, to bring salvation not just to you, but to the whole earth. But that was the whole point. The Jews were supposed to be God's missionary nation. There was never an intention of a special club or this exclusivity. They were meant to be the missionary people. But somehow they had forgotten their calling. They had missed their calling. And so Paul says this. He says, you know what? Since you guys refuse to do this, you refuse to live up to your calling, and you refuse to even hear the gospel I'm giving you, we're turning to the Gentiles. And so how do you think the Gentiles reacted?
Yeah, really.
It says when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
Yes.
The Gentiles at this point, they're used to being snubbed by the Jews.
Yeah.
They're used to being treated like second class to their special little club. And now Paul, a Jew, is saying, you know what? I'm going to you guys now, because you are receiving it happily, whereas the Jews, who I came to first, are now deeming themselves unworthy of it.
Yes.
Which is really, really awesome. It's really cool. I love the spread of the gospel to the Gentiles, to us.
Yeah.
You're watching the beginnings of us getting Jesus.
Yeah.
But the Jews, still not impressed. And so they start going around the city inciting riots and persecution towards Paul and Barnabas. And eventually they drive them out of the city. So that's, once again, in Pisidian Antioch, their first stop in Galatia. And this begins a bit of a pattern for Paul, a pattern for Barnabas. They'll show up to a city, they'll go to the Jews in the synagogue, and then the Jews in the synagogue will drive them out of the synagogue, and then they go to the Gentiles. And they did this repeatedly. And just like in Pisidian Antioch, when they went to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, the Jews wigged out and wouldn't hear anything of it, or very few of them would listen. And the Gentiles received it in mass.
Yes.
They received the gospel, whereas the Jews wouldn't, for the most part, would not listen. In fact, actually, the Jews from Pisidian Antioch followed them to Iconium, to Lystra, and to Derbe, driving them out of each place. But not before they spread the gospel to the Gentiles and not before they founded churches in every city. Pretty cool. By the way, I don't know if you can tell, this is almost 100 miles on foot. So for Paul and Barnabas, that's a serious journey. And then for these angry Jews, they're like, okay, honey, I'm going to be gone for a couple weeks as I chase this jerk down to this other city and drive him out of that one. And then the next one. And then the next one.
So, you answered one question, but the question I have is, so if the Gentiles, were looked down upon by the Jews, they really didn't have God, capital G, they had served gods, or, sun, moon, whatever.
Well, you guys are probably at least relatively familiar with Greek mythology, and then with Roman mythology, which is just an adapted version, really, of Greek mythology. So they had many gods they worshipped. Many gods. There is such a thing as a Gentile God-fearer.
What?
A Gentile God-fearer.
Fear.
So there were some Gentiles who believed in the God of the Jews, but they weren't accepted by Jews unless there's a formal an induction method for proselytes. And they had to be circumcised and do a bunch of other stuff, and then they could be considered proselytes. And even then, they're kind of like, they're definitely second tier. They're not pure blood Jew, but at least they're included. They're proselytes now.
Mm.
And then the ones who wouldn't get circumcised or go through the induction rite were Gentile God-fearers. And then there's just the rest of the Gentiles worshiping whatever else. But certainly, the Jews would not even go into the home of a Gentile, even if he was a God-fearer. They wouldn't associate with him. It's really sad.
Proselyte to me today means, I have a daughter-in-law who is Jewish, and her mother came over, and I was just sharing something about Jesus, and she said, Deb said, well, what are you doing? And she said, well, she's trying to proselytize me. I went, oh my gosh. I did answer it better than that, but so proselyte means you're trying to conform somebody else to.
Proselytizing
Yeah.
means trying to show people why your way of life is right. So
Right.
every Christian should be proselytizing.
Yeah.
Every Christian should be boldly sharing why Jesus Christ
She really
is Lord.
came at me,
A proselyte is someone who has been proselytized. So somebody has shared with them and they have converted.
Okay, it's not really bad.
Nope.
Because I always thought I was being bad.
No, people who aren't Christian, it's certainly not a negative term. People who aren't Christians, like atheists, especially like militant atheists, you try to proselytize them, there's nothing more insulting.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to be told that there's a different way of life. That,
Yeah.
They don't want to be told that you disagree with them.
What I said to her is, I'm not trying to convert you, I'm just sharing my faith. I don't know if that was good enough, but that's what it was.
Which is like, ideally, you would want to convert, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I didn't want
But
to insult
I get
her.
it. It is insulting. You're trying to convert me?
I know.
So it's tricky. There's some loaded terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, this is what happens in Galatia. We're nearing the end here. I'm gonna rush through the last couple questions. But once again, with how things went over here, with the Gentiles receiving the gospel of joy and with the Jews mostly rioting, any guesses as to what the churches in Galatia looked like? Mostly just Gentiles. Mostly Gentiles. Some Jews, lots of Gentiles. Now that's very important. It's very, very important for the issues being dealt with in Galatians and for the way Paul deals with them. Because the Gentiles are going to be a lot more impressionable than the Jewish converts. They might look to the Jewish Christians as more experienced, which they were. They knew the Old Testament. There wasn't a New Testament, so they knew all Scripture that they had. Christianity was kind of like Judaism 2.0 at that point. So once again, we have, it's written by Paul, and it's written to these 4 cities and these 4 churches right here that were founded on this missionary journey, under those circumstances. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, very interesting.
Because people pick up the Bible and they go, the church in Galatians, and they just read it through or whatever. This is how they were founded, the conditions they were founded under, what Paul did while he was there, and how the Gentiles over here were ecstatic to be able to have the same opportunity the Jews had. Pretty cool stuff. But it's going to be very important. I go through all of this because it is extremely relevant as we move forward. So the last couple questions I'm going to answer are going to be really quick here. When was this written? Any ideas?
Didn't you say 46, I did?
Nope. I said that this missionary journey took place between 46 and 47 AD. When was this letter written?
47, 48, maybe?
What did you say?
There's a line about how have you so quickly turned away from blah, blah, etc.
That is one reason why you might think that it'd be soon after this. He basically says, I'm having to get right back to you so quickly. You're already doing things that I have to correct. So that makes you think that it might be soon after, but a little vague. It could be 5 years, you know. It depends on what Paul decides is soon.
Let me read.
There's a really good reason to think that it was written almost immediately after this journey, or at least within a year. And the reason is the Jerusalem Council. You guys ever heard of that?
Yes.
The Jerusalem Church Council? The whole chapter 15 of the book of Acts is all about the Jerusalem Council. And the Jerusalem Council took place in either AD 48 or AD 49. Okay? I'll rush through this. And I'll go into the Jerusalem Council more next week as we get further into Galatians as it becomes more relevant. But basically, just know this. The single biggest issue that Paul covers in the book of Galatians, in the letter to the Galatians, is what the Jerusalem Council was all about. This particular issue. The church had been debating it back and forth. It was a major, major issue, finally culminating in all of the church leaders meeting together and coming to a decision. And so Paul felt very strongly in one way, and you're going to see how he felt in Galatians as he deals with this issue and the way he says things. And in the end, the church landed in his side and agreed with him and had basically made this major decision. Now, why is that meaningful? Because Paul, in this whole letter, doesn't mention this council once. He would have had every reason to. Because with the council's decision, it's not just Paul's opinion, it is the church's opinion. This is what's right and this is not. He really should have mentioned it. It would have been, less of a rogue opinion to these guys and more of like, okay, this is just what the church does. So why didn't he mention it? The best conclusion is that it hadn't happened yet. So he gets back from this missionary journey in 47 AD, and the Jerusalem Council takes place in either 48 AD or 49 AD, which leaves you a fairly small window, a year to a year and a half. And once again, he does say soon, having to write to you already. So in all likelihood, it's very soon after these churches were founded, which means they're very young, and they're just getting rolling. And so, coincidentally, this means, if this is accurate, then this is the first epistle that Paul wrote. Chronologically, this is the first one. Which is why this is the first letter we're looking at. The first book in the New Testament we're looking at. Because out of all of the books written in the New Testament, this is probably the first one chronologically. Side note. Have you guys ever wondered, looking in the New Testament, why Paul's epistles are arranged the way they are?
I was just wondering that.
Yes.
Why wouldn't that be first in here?
It's actually really simple. And I kicked myself when I found it out. I always assumed there was some greater meaning. First, you have all the letters written to churches, longest to shortest. And then you have all Paul's letters written to individuals, longest to shortest. And that's why it's arranged the way it is in the New Testament.
Wow.
Side note, it's not important. It's not going to make you closer to God, but there it is. And then I like interesting stuff like that.
Yeah,
It's fun.
yeah.
And now we have one last question. And this is going to be really important, especially as you guys read through this again. Why is Paul writing this letter to these churches?
Because Jews are coming in and questioning his authority and his motives.
Yeah, bottom line, and I think he says it really clearly in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. He finishes his introduction, and then he says this. He says, I am astounded that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. In other words, and we'll get more and more of this as we break down the letter, but he's basically saying, he introduces, this is Paul, the guy who came and talked to you and everything. I've heard that there are other people there who are teaching you things that are distortions of the gospel that I taught you. And I've heard you're actually listening to them. And I'm shocked. And I'm going to show you why you're wrong. I'm going to show you that you need to fix what you're doing. Now, I mean, that is in effect his reason for writing. That is the reason he's writing this letter, because the Galatian churches, these churches right here, in their very early stages of life, are being led astray by something or someone, and Paul is trying to correct it. Make sense?
Yes.
Now, Tammy just mentioned this, but based on what I just told you about the Galatian churches and how they were founded and what went down, any guesses as to who were the troublemakers, who were distorting the gospel? The Jews. Not just any Jews, but like Kim mentioned, the Jews that were causing problems in this church were Jewish Christians. Converts from Judaism to Christianity, that small group that converted when he was there. Mostly Gentiles, but some Jewish Christians, and they were saying, hey, you guys, here's how you should really be doing things. We know our way around this.
Yes.
And that's where we'll stop for tonight. We'll pick up on what the problem was, why it was an issue, and then getting into the meat of how Paul started to deal with the issue in this letter. Any questions? I'm sorry I kept you guys an extra 10 minutes or so. We had that orientation at the beginning.
Thank you.
That was so fascinating.